All right, why don't we reconvene and begin with our next panel, panel number 6, which is another ag panel. Why don't we begin with Mr. Peterson?
Good afternoon, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Miller, and Board Member Begeman. My name is Lance Peterson. I'm a corn, soybean, and wheat farmer from Underwood, Minnesota, in west central Minnesota. I'd like to thank you for traveling to this area and allowing us to have this further discussion on the very important rail issues. My testimony today is on behalf of the American Soybean Growers Association and also the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. On April 10th of this year, I had the opportunity to testify before your board in Washington. And at that hearing, the message I delivered was that inadequate rail service through delays and increased freight costs is not just a business challenge, but creates a massive loss which is passed on directly to the agriculture producer, the farmer. We've heard about that message today, so I won't expound on it, but I certainly want to reaffirm it. It's real dollars. The dollars that I had, the dollar amount that I talked about in April 10th was $100,000 for one producer. That was myself. You take that times the thousands of producers in the upper Midwest, and we reach that very sizable figure in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a staggering sum of money. It impacts not only the farmer, but the farm community, and indeed Main Street. At the April hearing, the rail industry stressed that the cold winter had severely impacted the ability to move rail cars. They talked about the huge push to clean up that issue, and in fact, the statement was made that it was likely to be taken care of by June, and we have certainly passed that mark, and there's still a fair amount of last year's crop that is still present in the bins. I've heard numerous stories where grain bin companies are experiencing a very large sales amount this year to the point where they literally cannot take on any more business. Certainly some of that is because of the bountiful crops that we expect to harvest, but some of that is because the farmers are in a very difficult position of having their bins still full of last year's crops and having to figure out how to deal with this year's harvest and wanting to avoid piling it on the ground. So certainly a very serious situation. The rail problems of last year have grain shippers trying to figure out how to navigate through this year. Heard the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Cope, had talked about millions of dollars being spent to reserve or to access shuttle trains for this coming year. $2.5 million per shuttle was the number I talked about with my local shipper. That equates to about $700 per car just to access that rail car. And that's a number that in years past was virtually non-existent. You put the order in or participate in the auction, but we're not paying in the millions of dollars in order to access that shuttle for the year. So that, with that said though, that dollar amount, that $2.5 million, was paid with the expectations that we will see an adequate turnaround time of these shuttle trains. And right now, the figure that's being talked about is 2.5 times per month. And if that number holds true, then the freight that is purchased will hopefully meet the needs of the shipper for this season. But that's what brings forward the area of concern. If indeed the shippers have to go out and seek additional freight on the secondary market, Mr. Cope had expressed that the secondary market numbers were now down around, I think, 1,000 or slightly more than that in order to access cars in that route. The number that I had heard exactly 1 week ago today, the bid price was $3,500 per car. That's for October, November shipment. The ask was, that's per car, yep. So for corn, at 4,000 bushels per rail car. If the bid was $3,500, the asking price was north of $4,500 per car. So if we use 4,000 as the point where those two possibly come together, that's still $1 per bushel that secondary market was asking for last week at this time. And has that market possibly softened since then? It is possible because of the changes, in fact, actually the challenges we're seeing in spring wheat harvest. Not as much spring wheat has been harvested at this time, so some of those trains are becoming available for use for other things. So that does talk about the fluctuating ability of that secondary market, but it also speaks to the importance of we desperately need to see adequate rail movement this fall to keep the shippers from needing to access that secondary market. They need to be able to rely on that freight that they've already booked and put that to use. Through the directive of the Surface Transportation Board, we now know the movement, velocity, and turnaround time of grain cars And this is helpful, but that's only part of the story. Mr. Whiteside brought up in the previous panel, he said, we really are to the point where we want to know the metrics of what's happening in the other sectors of the rail industry. Obviously, the oil is the one that really comes to mind. And that, I echo those comments in what I had put together as testimony. How and where are the railroad assets of the locomotives, crews, and tracks being utilized? Are the rail assets consistently managed for total overall efficiency? Or are some sectors being favored over the others? And the only way to answer that question is to include full reporting of rail service. So my request to the Surface Transportation Board is to require the railroads to submit the metrics showing past dues, average days late, turnaround times, et cetera, for agricultural shippers, the oil industry, coal, and other customers. This information would help to give a clear picture of railroad service issues, and based on the size and scope of the rail shipment problems being faced in the upper Midwest, this is not too much to ask. My testimony is very brief in light of the fact that a lot of the points have been already touched on in previous panels today, so I'll shift to my summary. Basically, we know that the farm losses have been tremendous. We're very concerned about the upcoming fall peak use. And lastly, increasing transparency through full disclosure can only help to understand the factors that affect rail movement as we move forward to find solutions. And thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Peterson.
Good afternoon, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Miller, Commissioner Bigeman. My name is Eric Broughton. I'm a farmer from eastern North Dakota. I farm 90 miles northwest of here. I'm taking time today to speak with you on behalf of the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association and all farmers across the state that are dealing with transportation issues. Where I farm, corn and soybeans have become a majority of what we grow. Our need for storage and transportation have increased due to higher yields associated with corn. To address this issue on our farm, we have added 1.25 million bushels of storage in the past 2 years. Farmers in North Dakota need this storage capacity on farm because we have very extreme harvest conditions. Our local elevators do their best to work with producers and provide the best service they can. But with ever-present weather threats, farmers are forced to harvest their crop as quickly as possible or risk losing it. During this increased harvest pressure, elevators will fill with grain and need timely trains to provide the storage needed to hold the entire crop. To address this issue, producers have started to build their own storage, allowing them to dump directly into their bins without having to wait in line at the elevator or risk getting caught with their local elevator full and not being able to unload grain. Another real issue on the horizon, due to the increased basis in the upper Midwest and lower cash price, a lot of 2013 grain is stored in farmers' bins is still there. Yes, many elevators are going to be empty going into harvest, but the built-in buffer of on-farm storage will run out almost immediately. This puts an increased demand on railroads for timely movement of grain through these elevators, so producers can continue to harvest their grain before losing it to weather. To prepare for this, farmers have started to look for other ways to store their grain. Has been mentioned earlier, piling on the ground, using older, maybe salvageable grain bins that haven't been used previously. Traditionally, our marketing doesn't require us to hold this much crop, but farmers fell victim to the basis. When we harvest, we usually store grain on farm and then deliver this grain either in the spring or summer. This is done to capitalize on a traditionally better basis because the demand to move grain is lower during this time, usually lowering the costs as well. This year didn't play out that way, and this spring we were faced with a horrible basis. This basis or cost of transportation is directly taken out of what I get paid for my grain. Last spring, realizing how important this issue was and how greatly it affected me and my ability to pay my bills, I jumped in a plane with Lance Peterson and went to DC to listen to the STB hearing. After sitting through this meeting, I left thinking the railroad, a partner that the Midwest farmers have helped to build and are extremely dependent on, was going to start to improve and our basis would come down. We were told of improvements being made and excuses from a horrible winter. This would be corrected and rail service would return to normal. This basis improvement never came. I understand this is not due entirely to the rail carriers, but also to the secondary market taking advantage of the situation. Along with the drop in commodity prices, this left farmers with a tremendous amount of grain still in their bins. As we look at the growing demand for rail service and the growth the railroad is undertaking, I am worried that we are still falling behind. Yes, the railroad is working very hard to improve service, but we are in a remarkable time of growth in our state. This year, the North Dakota soybean crop is estimated at more than 190 million bushels, an all-time high. As a soybean farmer from North Dakota, I know 95% of my crop will leave this state, and much will leave this country to be consumed. We as farmers absolutely need the railroad to continue to provide the world with a dependable source of protein. In the past, we were told of weather issues and quick fixes that would help to improve the rail service. I think everyone knows what needs to be done will not be a quick fix. On my farm last year, we raised nearly 1 million bushels of grain. Because of rail service issues, I estimate the basis on my crops increased about 60 cents per bushel. 60 cents per bushel times 1 million bushels equals $600,000 in potential lost income due to these transportation issues. There have been times this year where the basis has been $1 per bushel over where it traditionally is. If we take that over a corn yield of 150 bushels per acre, that's an additional $150 per acre towards transportation costs. This additional transportation cost would be higher than any other single cost: land payment, seed, fertilizer, or chemical. Farmers in the Midwest cannot afford to pay these high costs and continue to be in operation. I'm asking for the railroads to continue to work with producers of the Midwest and provide the rail service we have come to expect, along with providing producers with an accurate information, whether it is good news or bad. We support the request made by ASA for the STB to require railroads to submit metrics showing past dues, average days late, and turnaround times for agricultural customers versus crude oil customers and other customers. We are ready to help find long-term solutions for this ongoing transportation challenge. As grain marketers trying to figure out a very complex market, our ability to successfully market our grain is extremely dependent on reliable information. I appreciate the time to speak with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Miller, and Commissioner Begeman. My name is Christine O'Connell, and I am the Trading and Operations Coordinator for Trinidad Benham Corporation from Denver, Colorado. Trinidad Benham is the leading independent packager of dry, edible beans in the United States. We have in recent years made strong investments in North Dakota for our bean origination needs. We opened a facility in Pillsbury, North Dakota in 2010 and an additional facility in Colgate, North Dakota last year. Railroad service is extremely important for us at these facilities to maintain our product flow, beginning with the grower and ultimately ending at one of our nationwide packaging distribution systems. Since December 2013, I've had to file over 300 COT claims due to past car orders outside the guarantee period. I am cautiously optimistic with the improvements I've seen with the BNSF. I feel they've done a good job responding to our complaints and notified us of their plans to improve car supply and railroad service. We do still continue to have car order fulfillment problems in western North Dakota. For example, since June 2014, late shipments in Ray, North Dakota have increased by 23 days. The most recent COT claims filed for July and August shipments resulted with an average days late of 71 days. Other areas of North Dakota that are still challenging for car supply needs are Leeds, North Dakota, with an average of 45 days late, along with Johnstown, Northwood, and Walhalla, North Dakota, each at 36 days late on average. This was a ship period after the BNSF had said they would improve car order fulfillment. I find that as car supply improves, at the same time the service levels have deteriorated. In the past month, we had a loaded car wait for more than 30 days in Colgate, North Dakota before it was pulled. I communicated regularly with the trainmaster, and the constant factor was the lack of crew. I even questioned why I wasn't notified of missed switches. I was told that they don't have the manpower to notify customers of a missed switch. Our Colgate, North Dakota facility has service only 1 day a week. For every missed switch, we are out 2 weeks. If this continues into harvest, we will run out of storage capacity and therefore be unable to receive additional beans, essentially shutting us down. We are also experiencing service problems in Colorado. Since July 2014, 100% of the BNSF cars en route to our plant in Greeley, Colorado, have resulted in plant shutdown logs. I've been told it's due to congestion in Denver, Colorado. I have noticed cars can sit anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks in Omaha, Nebraska before heading towards Denver. There are also interchange problems at our plant in Sterling, Colorado. For example, since June 2014, our transit times from North Dakota to Sterling, Colorado have increased 21 days. On average, we see a delay of 7 full days before a car that has arrived in Sterling, Colorado is interchanged to the UP for delivery. I currently have a car on the BNSF in Sterling, Colorado that has been there for 2 weeks without an interchange. As much as I can complain about the car supply on the BNSF, there have been a couple CP shippers that have had no choice but to turn to the BNSF for service due to car order delays. The outstanding CP car orders were topping the 70-day mark on average. One shipper that used BNSF cars to fulfill a contract for us eventually received the cars from the CP 113 days past due. And also going off Mr. Brooks' statement about the cancellations of cars no longer needed, I wonder how many of those are no longer needed because shippers had to truck and turn to different loading facilities with the BNSF. I also wanted to go to some comments that Mr. Leese of the BNSF spoke about using alternate junctions for Chicago. Our largest packaging facility is outside of Nashville, Tennessee on the CSX. I route all of my freight through Chicago. I've constantly asked for rates into East St. Louis and Memphis, and I've never gotten them. So if they would like shippers to try to use an alternate route, because all my freight's Rule 11, I decide which way it's routed, then I would love a motivation of a better rate. But the rates are higher to East St. Louis, they're higher to Memphis, and then on the other hand, then the CSX, who serves Tennessee, then they need to also reciprocate with better rates out of those junctions as well, but we don't see them, so we're not going to route our freight in that lane. Trinidad Benham is an employee-owned company of over 700 people who rely on consistent railroad service out of this region. I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to our service needs. We are looking forward to drastic improvements with your continued support.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ed Prosser. I am the VP of Agricultural Trading at Gavilon LLC. Gavilon is a grain and ingredient fertilizer asset management, supply chain management company based in Omaha. I appreciate the board's flexibility in moving me up from the 8th panel. I've got a conflict on my transportation, ironically. I've been told that I'm a little verbose, so I'm going to read my testimony to make sure that I stay underneath my time limit. I want to thank the STB for the opportunity to share Gavilon's thoughts today. Gavilon is the second largest grain storage company in the United States, as well as one of the largest fertilizer distributors in the world. We have approximately 200 grain and fertilizer facilities scattered throughout the United States. We are particularly sensitive to transportation issues in the Northern Plains, as we have 15 facilities in the Dakotas, along with 83 employees. Gavilon is an asset and supply chain management company. We do not produce or consume the agricultural products we handle. We manage the logistics, both storage and movement, for farmers and end users. This puts us in a unique vantage point to comment on the current rail problems. First, to define this as a rail-only transportation problem is too simple. These perishable commodities will find a way to market, even if certain avenues are closed. The inflation that we've seen in the rail freight market has affected other modes of transportation as well. We are seeing some regions where truck freight costs have doubled. Other ways of moving grain, such as container boxes and barges, are historically high. What started as a regional rail crisis has turned into a nationwide transportation tax on agricultural commodities. This tax has to be paid by someone in the supply chain. Today, it has pushed interior price levels much cheaper than expected, which comes out of the farmer's pocket. On the sell side of the transaction, the increased freight that we must pass on has pushed export prices to levels that make us uncompetitive with our world peers. Gavilon has learned long ago that we cannot manage what we cannot measure. We would encourage the board to continue requiring the Class I railroads to provide benchmarks so the outside can fully assess their performance. Gavilon is a member of the National Grain and Feed Association, and we fully support the additional metrics that the NGFA is recommending. First, real-time information on train velocity and cycle times, as well as realistic projections on restoring service. Second, weekly car loadings by product and state. Third, weekly average dwell times for trains hauling grain and grain products, coal, and crude oil. Fourth, weekly averages for miles per day transited for grain, coal, and crude oil. 5, the level of capacity utilization by rail corridors, including the heavy grain corridors of the PNW and Texas Gulf. And finally, real-time data on the number of grain, oilseed, coal, and crude oil sets transported by rail. We believe that the forces of the market are the best distributor of scarce resources. However, when certain utilities are granted singular access to provide essential services, sometimes the market is prevented from rewarding good behavior and punishing bad. Those penalties accrue to the customers of the railroad, be it a farmer or an exporter. Today, the railroad have no penalty for non-performance. We encourage the STB to use its oversight powers to bring transparency to the process of distribution of assets within the railroads and to make the railroad a stakeholder in the process. One way for us as a company and agriculture as an industry to be able to effectively manage the increased logistics risks that we are taking on as a result of the current rail situation is to be able to have better information regarding the data that NGFA is requesting. Agriculture and the railroads have a long and intertwined history. We should not forget the efficient provider of transportations that the railroads have been, and we applaud the additional capital investments that several of the carriers have recently committed to making. However, in the recent past, it is increasingly evident that the railroad sales commitments have exceeded their infrastructure spending. We would encourage the board to be the reasonable voice advocating disciplined sales increases until infrastructure can catch up. To assure that agriculture continues to be able to make effective use of the limited transportation available to us, we request that the board require the railroads to make public the benchmarks that it and the public can use to assess the performance and the efficiencies of the railroads. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question that I asked the other group with respect to the new CP designated train system. Have any of you had any involvement in that at all? No?
We are going to participate, and I think at this point it's too early in the process to really understand how it's going to work.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chairman?
As a follow-up on that question, one of the issues that have come up is whether or not there was any coercion from the railroad CP towards shippers to kind of wipe out those past grain car orders. What was your experience?
We have none. I have no comment. I do not know in our system. We chose to become a partner in their new dedicated system, but to my knowledge, I don't know that we had any past car orders.
Anyone else on the panel? Ms. O'Connell, I wanted to be sure that I understood this. And so did I understand you to say that you've asked for rates so that you can go someplace other than Chicago, but you can't get a rate?
There's because we're in edible beans, the Book 5 tariff under the BNSF has some rates into Memphis, but not from origins that we ship. And so I've asked for some into Memphis. From the North Dakota region, I've never seen any. I'm sure I could do a mileage scale, but like I've said, there's not really much motivation if I'm going to be paying more freight to move on a different lane.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm just sort of curious kind of what the time frame might be before we all should become extraordinarily alarmed about this fall's harvest. Mr. Broughton, as you were saying, you kind of left the hearing in April feeling better, thinking things were going to get better, and then they didn't. You know, again, in some ways, I think there's a feeling, you know, getting rid of that 2013 crop, we're going to be ready for 2014. But what's kind of the canary in the mine from your perspective of when everyone's going to realize, I mean, should we come to that point, what would signal to us that this is really not going to be good?
Right now in our area where I farm, most of the shuttle loader elevators are becoming empty. Wheat harvest hasn't started yet, or is just beginning. That delay, that will start to fill up the elevators. Hopefully they'll be able to move that wheat back out. When soybean harvest begins, which will be delayed again this year, the entire harvest will be set back. When the soybean harvest begins, traditionally a large amount of soybeans are sold directly to the elevators because they don't store quite as well as some of the other crops do. So we'll see the elevators become full with soybeans, and corn harvest, with the soybean harvest being delayed and expecting probably a frost coming near that point in time when soybean harvest begins, corn harvest could start immediately into, you know, the ending of soybean harvest. And when these elevators become full with soybeans, we're going to have a really big problem with finding a place to put the corn from
So
this
you're
year's
saying
harvest.
if we get to the end of soybean harvest and soybeans haven't been able to move out, then you know before corn harvest has started, it's going to be big trouble.
Yeah, we might not even be able to get through soybean harvest without having issues.
And you said soybean harvest is looking like it's going to start late this year, but when would it normally start, and what does late mean? Does that mean a week, 10 days, 2 weeks?
I would say probably soybean harvest would, you know, we always are playing Mother Nature, so we never know, and that's kind of an ongoing theme of why this is so difficult, because there is no certain dates, there is no certain times. Soybean harvest for us probably won't begin until October of this year, which typically it could begin as early September, maybe mid-September being, end of September being more average, but we'll be into October on our farm probably before we start harvesting soybeans.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very helpful testimony. I will say I've kind of had alarms going off since we've had the hearing last April, but I'll try to keep them toned down since you guys have managed to do so as well. I will say I'm quite impressed that for most of the panels, the part of their theme isn't, oh my God, we have to have service, we are so desperate, is that you would be almost satisfied and appreciate data. And I would think that that would be something that we could all work on and try to get there. I think that everyone here probably has thought about that idea as well. I also would just like to encourage, there are probably more representatives from BNSF than there are from unserved shippers, but if someone maybe could talk with Ms. O'Connell and just help her understand how maybe she could get a rate going to get out of Chicago, or help her, and maybe help all of us understand why that wouldn't be possible. But please, if you'll reach out and talk with her, I'd appreciate that. That's all I have.
Thank you. I just want to thank you very much for coming. This is a great panel just because we had everything from a family farmer to a large global ag company. So it's very helpful just to get a broader perspective on these issues, and to throw in also the soybean issues was very helpful. I do urge you also, if you're not getting what you need, to reach out to us, to the Rail Customer and Public Assistance Program. I don't know, we can't solve everything, but we can certainly work with you and try very hard to get things solved. Thank you very much.